They rigged MY review to block MY promotion 2 years ago. My manager told me in a closed-door meeting that my performance review scores were too inconsistent to support a promotion I'd been working toward for 3 years. I found out 14 months later that those scores weren't inconsistent at all. They'd been changed, after I submitted them, by the same manager who told me they weren't good enough. This is the story of how a spreadsheet formula caught what a person never would have admitted to Chapter 1. My name is Simonich Turberg. 4 years ago, I joined a mid-size pharmaceutical sales company called Corville Health as a territory sales representative, covering the eastern half of Ohio. Pharmaceutical sales is a brutal, numbers-driven business. Your quota isn't a suggestion. It's the entire job. For 3 straight years, I hit my quota every single quarter. Not just hit it, exceeded it, consistently, in one of the more difficult territories in our entire region, one that had gone through 4 different reps in the 6 years before I took it over. My manager was a man named Peter Havorson, Regional Sales Director, overseeing 11 territory reps across 3 states. Peter had built his own career the old-fashioned way, grinding up through the ranks over almost 20 years, and he had a very particular philosophy about promotions. He believed in seasoning. His word, not mine. He believed people needed to prove themselves for years beyond what their numbers already showed, because numbers, in his words, don't tell you everything about someone's readiness. I heard that phrase a lot over 3 years. Every review cycle, my numbers were undeniable. Every review cycle, something else, an intangible, hard-to-name quality, was cited as the reason I wasn't quite ready for the senior territory manager role I'd been targeting. In my 3rd year, a senior territory manager position opened up in our region. I'd trained for it. I'd taken on mentorship of 2 newer reps specifically to build the leadership experience Peter always said I lacked. My quarterly numbers going into that review cycle were the strongest of my entire career, 141% of quota, the highest in the region that quarter. I walked into my annual review meeting feeling, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely confident. If you've ever walked into a review certain you'd finally earned something, only to watch the goalposts move one more time, comment below. Because that's exactly what happened to me next chapter 2. Peter slid a printed review packet across the table. I remember the specific moment my stomach dropped, not from the quota numbers, which were accurate, but from the leadership readiness section beneath them, where a series of scored categories, things like cross-functional collaboration and strategic account planning, showed numbers significantly lower than I remembered submitting in my own self-assessment weeks earlier. "Simone, your quota performance is excellent, as always," Peter said. "But looking at the full picture here, especially in the leadership competency areas, I don't think we're quite ready to move forward with the senior territory manager role this cycle." "Peter, these leadership scores don't match what I submitted," I said, flipping back through the packet. My self-assessment had these categories rated significantly higher, and I included specific examples: the mentorship program with the 2 new reps, the cross-regional account restructuring I led in Q2. "Self-assessments are just one input," Peter said smoothly. "My assessment and the calibration discussion with the broader leadership team ultimately shapes the final numbers." I didn't have a strong enough grasp of exactly how the review calibration process worked to push back further in that moment. I left that meeting frustrated, but not yet suspicious. Corporate performance reviews are subjective by nature. I told myself again that this was simply how it worked, that Peter's seasoning philosophy would eventually run its course, and my numbers would speak loudly enough to overcome it. I didn't know yet that Peter had a much more specific reason for keeping me exactly where I was. Chapter break here. I want you to remember that phrase, calibration discussion, because it becomes very important later in this story. For now, just know that it was the excuse used to explain away numbers that, it turns out, were never actually calibrated by anyone but Peter himself. Chapter THREI stayed at Corville for another full year after that review, still hitting quota, still training junior reps, still hoping the next cycle would be different. It wasn't. My 4th year review followed almost the exact same pattern: outstanding quota numbers, then a set of leadership competency scores mysteriously lower than what I'd submitted. with Peter citing the same vague calibration explanation. This time, I asked a more specific question. Peter, can you show me the calibration notes? I'd like to understand exactly what specific feedback led to these adjusted scores. Peter hesitated just slightly before answering. The calibration discussions aren't typically shared in detail. It's meant to be a holistic leadership assessment, not a line-by-line audit. That answer didn't sit right with me. I'd worked in enough structured corporate environments to know that holistic is often the word people use when they don't want you looking too closely at specifics. A few weeks later, at a regional conference, I ran into a former Corville employee, a woman named Deja Whitmore, who'd left the company the year before to take a director role at a competitor. We caught up over coffee, and somewhere in that conversation, almost casually, she mentioned something that changed the entire trajectory of what I thought was happening. You know, Peter's had, 3 senior territory manager openings in the last 4 years, she said. And every single one went external or to someone from outside your territory group. Did you ever notice that? I hadn't, not consciously. But once she said it, I started thinking back. She was right. Every promotion into that specific role across the entire time I'd worked under Peter had gone to someone new, never to an existing rep who'd been building toward it internally. Why would that be? I asked. Deja shrugged. No idea, but it always struck me as strange. Made me wonder if he liked keeping his strongest people exactly where they were, instead of promoting them up and having to replace them. If that theory is starting to sound familiar to anyone listening, comment below. Because it turned out to be a lot more specific and a lot more deliberate than even Deja realized. Chapter FOURI started paying much closer attention after that conversation. I kept meticulous copies of every self-assessment I submitted going forward, saved with timestamps. Backed up outside of the company's internal HR system, in a personal cloud folder Peter had no access to. My 5th-year review cycle, I submitted my self-assessment exactly as I had every year before, detailed, specific, with concrete metrics and examples for every leadership competency category, time-stamped, and saved externally the moment I hit submit. This time, though, something unusual happened before the formal review meeting. Corville rolled out a new HR software platform company-wide, replacing the older review system Peter had used for years. As part of the transition, HR sent every employee a data export of their historical review records, framed as a routine, verify your data migrated correctly request. I opened my export and compared it, line by line, against the time-stamped copies I'd saved externally for the past 2 review cycles. The numbers didn't match. Not close. My self-assessment leadership scores, the ones I'd submitted directly into the system, had been edited after submission. The export showed a modification timestamp on each altered category, roughly 6 days after my original submission date, each time for 2 consecutive years. The modification logs, buried in a metadata tab most employees would never think to open, showed the edits had been made under an administrative account tied specifically to Peter's login credentials. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that spreadsheet for almost an hour, second twist right on schedule. If you're enjoying this story, go ahead and subscribe now, because what I found in that export was only the beginning. Chapter FIVEI didn't confront Peter directly. Not yet. I understood enough about corporate politics by that point to know that raising this internally, without a clear path to escalate it if Peter simply denied everything, would put me right back where I'd been 3 years earlier, my word against his, with him holding significantly more organizational power than I did. Instead, I quietly reached out to Corville's internal ethics hotline, an anonymous reporting channel the company maintained specifically for situations involving potential HR data manipulation or retaliation. I submitted the export data, the modification timestamps, and my externally saved self-assessment copies as supporting documentation. Within a week, I was contacted by someone from Corville's internal audit team, a careful, precise man named Aaron Blackwood, who explained that my report had triggered a formal investigation, separate from the normal HR review process, specifically because data manipulation by a manager using administrative access was considered a serious compliance issue under the company's internal controls policy. Over the following 2 months, Aaron's team pulled review records for every rep who'd reported to Peter over the past 5 years. The pattern that emerged was almost identical to what Deja had noticed anecdotally, except now it was backed by hard data. 8 different reps across 5 years had leadership competency scores modified downward after submission, always by roughly the same margin, always timed just before a formal review meeting, always for reps whose quota performance was strong enough that a promotion request would have been difficult for Peter to deny on merit alone. Every single one of those 8 reps had, like me, hit strong numbers and been told in one form or another that they simply weren't ready yet. Asterisk, if you're starting to see the full shape of this now, you're exactly where I was at this point in the investigation. And it gets worse before it gets better. Stick around, because the confrontation is coming. Asterisk, chapter, SIX**, Aaron's team eventually connected the pattern to something even more specific than a general reluctance to promote strong performers. Peter's compensation structure, it turned out, included a significant retention bonus tied to keeping experienced, high-performing territory reps in place rather than losing them to internal promotions that would require backfilling and retraining a territory from scratch. A bonus structure introduced by Corville's previous regional VP years earlier, meant to reward manager stability, but never updated or reviewed since. Peter had figured out, whether through calculation or gradual rationalization, that keeping his strongest reps exactly where they were, year after year, quietly maximized his own bonus, at the direct expense of the careers of the people generating the numbers that earned it. He wasn't blocking promotions because he doubted our leadership readiness. He was blocking them because our staying exactly where we were was worth real money to him personally. Once Aaron's team presented the full findings to Corville's senior leadership, including the compensation structure conflict of interest, the company moved quickly. Peter was placed on administrative leave within days, and after a final round of review, terminated for cause, citing both the unauthorized data manipulation and the undisclosed conflict of interest tied to the retention bonus structure. I was one of 8 people finally told the truth about what had actually kept us in place for years. This is the part of the story that still makes my hands shake a little when I think about it, honestly. Not because of what happened to Peter. Because of how close I came to simply accepting his explanation, year after year, if that HR system migration hadn't accidentally handed me the evidence I needed. Sometimes the truth really does depend on a small, unglamorous detail nobody thought to hide carefully enough. If that resonates with you, drop a comment. Chapter 7, Corville's leadership, facing the reality that 8 employees had been quietly held back for years through data manipulation, moved to correct it directly rather than simply moving on. I was offered the senior territory manager promotion I'd been denied twice, backdated for compensation purposes to the original review cycle, where my legitimate scores should have qualified me for it, along with back pay covering the difference. 2 of the other 7 reps affected had already left Corville for other companies by the time the investigation concluded. Corville reached out to both of them individually with formal corrections to their records and financial settlements. The remaining reps, like me, were offered promotions or compensation adjustments reflecting where their careers should have been all along. I sat in a new performance review meeting almost a year later, this time with a new regional sales director, a woman named Farida Osai, brought in specifically to rebuild trust in the department. Farida had a very different philosophy than Peter's vague, seasoning standard. I don't believe in holding people back with language I can't specifically define and defend, she told me in that first review. If you can show me the number and you can show me the example, that's what goes in your file. No calibration mystery. If you'd been in my position, would you have stayed at a company after finding out something like this? Or would the trust have been broken permanently? I go back and forth on this one. Comment below, because we're almost at the end. Chapter 8, I stayed at Corville. Partly because the correction, once it came, was thorough and genuine, and partly because I'd spent 3 years building relationships in that territory, with reps I'd personally mentored, that I didn't want to abandon over one person's misconduct, however serious it had been. I still keep everything timestamped and saved externally now, out of habit more than necessity. Farida's review process is transparent enough that I probably don't need to anymore. But old instincts, once they're earned the hard way, are hard to fully let go of. I think about that first review with Peter a lot, sitting across from him, watching him explain away numbers I knew were right with a word. Calibration, vague enough that I had no way to argue against it. It took a company-wide software migration, an accidental data export, and an hour at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet to finally understand what had actually been happening the whole time. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Keep your own records, even when everything about the process seems too official, too routine, too boring to bother second-guessing. The most serious injustices I've ever seen at work weren't hidden behind anything dramatic. They were hidden behind a single word, repeated calmly, year after year, by someone counting on nobody ever asking exactly what it meant. If you're sitting in a review right now being told you're not quite ready without a clear, specific reason why, I want you to know it's worth asking harder questions than I did, for far longer than 3 years. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more coming every week. And tell me honestly, would you have stayed at Corville after everything that happened or walked away? I read every single comment. See you in the next one.